The Arab Spring, 2010 and 2011. Arab citizens from across the Middle East collectively, one after another, descend on the streets and do something they have rarely done over the past century: hold their leaders and governments accountable. Freedoms, civil rights, the rule of law, and the implementation of justice are but a few of the many demands that these Arabs were calling out for. Accountability was on the lips of a large contingent of Arabs. But this accountability would be short-lived, sputtering out of fuel within a couple of years. And now, many years later, no further real tangible accountability seems to have regrouped and returned. Why? The happenings of the Arab Spring clashed together as one Black Swan event. The same regimes and systems of rule had existed and governed over many years with no real movement or hope for change. The same suppression, injustice, lack of basic human rights. Decades and decades of immobility and strife. Yet it took one event in Tunisia for all hell to break loose. The Arab Spring should be considered as a Black Swan event because so many elements of the uprising were later, in hindsight, rationalized. Although at the time, it seemed that circumstances coincidentally came together to cause such uproar. Was this truly a buildup of anger, an awareness of helplessness, and then an application of accountability? Or could it be that the Arab Spring was purely a valve release after many decades of suppression? And if it's purely a valve release, does this mean that this version or any other version of accountability won't resurface for, let's say, another 3 to 4 decades? You see, there's retribution and there's accountability. Arabs know retribution well. But accountability is not really an Arab thing. There are lots of factors that contribute to its lack of application throughout the Arabs' modern history. Factors that are inherent within the political, religious, cultural, and traditional psyche of Arabs. Factors that position accountability outside the realm of choices for Arab behavior and the Arab condition. Because unlike retribution, accountability is a look within. And I'd like to shed light on these factors that hold back the Arabs in applying accountability on every level. But first, a clarification. Accountability in its most complete definition is a top-down, bottom-up proposition. Everyone is accountable. In most Arab nations, the accountability stops just before the absolute top, the leadership, and the absolute bottom, the individual. Everyone can be wrong, mistaken, and accountable except for the ruler or their clan or the one effusing blame. The social contracts that exist between ruler and common folk are very specific to the Arab world. Many nations amongst the Arab world follow ancient tribal pledges of allegiance that date back more than 1 to 3 centuries, thereby making the holding of these pseudo-tribal leadership accountable off limits. Further complicating this matter is the fact that most Arabs are governed by either autocratic or monarchic systems, and hence accountability practices can only go so high. Another point that is often overlooked is that the Arab world has become too comfortable with the status quo, with the fact of life as being a struggle that is often tempered by the solace within faith. And this can oftentimes lead to a lack of self-reflection and self-directed criticism, thereby numbing one's resistance to tyranny, injustice, and incompetence, while suppressing the simple aspiration for rights of a better life. The factors that prohibit Arabs from administering accountability are intertwined. It's difficult to ascertain which factor influenced or superseded the other. Regardless of that detail, let's dive into them. The first factor is holding history to account. How can anyone who wants to hold the present accountable not first start with wanting to be well-grounded with the holding of their own history to test? What I mean by history is the people and actions taken by leadership or society as a whole in the Arab past that has led Arabs to what and where they are today. In opposition to this is the principle that speaking or backbiting of the dead is a no-no. Now, this might be part of a pre-Islamic tradition and trait, or one that came into existence with the growth of the Muslim faith, but nonetheless today, Arabs don't talk ill of any deceased person. Well, at least in their beliefs, they shouldn't. Yet, holding the past actions of leaders around the world, even back in the fledgling histories of Arab nations, holding them accountable, is an imperative part of understanding the present situations confronting the Arabs. So first and foremost, these unfortunate events don't repeat themselves. Instead, Arabs shy away and avoid looking back in condemnation of misdeeds purely because one doesn't want to either dishonor the dead or open historical, painful wounds, even if it would mean learning a great deal about themselves or their plights. And this lack of an option for accountability and taking of responsibility leads to the false glorification of a past, which then leads to the creation of alternative histories, conspiracy theories, the blaming of others. And when looking back at this lack of accountability from the majority Arab Muslim perspective, blaming those or holding those in history as responsible, meaning those who are now dead, then greater resistance is uncovered. Speaking ill of the dead is not a sin per se, nor does such empty speech have any impact on God's ultimate judgment of those who have conducted themselves poorly in life. But in the Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 12, God does say, "And do not spy on one another, nor backbite. Would you like to eat the flesh of your dead brother? Of course not. You would hate it." Although reputed to be a hadith but not a correct one, a saying used often by Arabs that clearly represents overall Islamic teachings is the saying, "Adhkuru hasanat Speak of the good qualities and deeds of your dead." Overall, even though the faith in many of its teachings praises the accountability of ongoing Muslim leadership and self, especially concerning the element of moral integrity, the faith seems to push the Arab Muslims away from criticizing that same leadership and their actions who reside in history, to let bygones be bygones and to solely look ahead so that no one, neither the dead nor the living, meaning the dead's descendants, is impacted by the exposure of their misdeeds and eventually lead to potential disrespect. Moving away from the social accountability that exists between leadership or governments and their citizens, the same reservations apply to the cultural traits of Arabs within the familial or communal structure. Arabs don't hold their elders accountable. Wrong or right, that would be tantamount to disrespect. Within mostly patriarchal systems of Arab societies, this would mean holding a grandfather or father responsible for the life situation of a son or daughter, brother or sister, or even the entire family. Simply an impossible proposition, or at its most, very rare. And this taboo act of blaming or confronting a parent or elder family member conditions in Arabs a hesitancy for when one wants to hold accountable those who hold immediate authority over them, be it in public institutions, in the workplace, and elsewhere. So a noble respect for elders ultimately produces a condition of submission to those in authority, those who should be held accountable but never are. Today in Arab society, the absence of this accountability reigns across many layers of both professional and private domains. The corrupt government official who is rewarded when he or she should be brought to justice. The politically or theologically biased educator who is sustained freely to practice his targeted conditioning of the youth. Such a lack of accountability only breeds moral decline and destroys hope. And that's where we see in many surveys conducted post-Arab Spring, asking what was needed most in the Arab world to drastically improve the way of life for the populations, the recurring theme was one word: accountability. Now, one thing to clarify is that a call for accountability doesn't necessarily mean the prerequisite of Western societal values or democratic systems, not by any means. Arabs should find their own governance space as they found their own societal and value system. And hence, such an introduction of accountability at its very beginnings demands the reprogramming of mindsets. Mindsets that will apply and action accountability, as mentioned, top to bottom, bottom up. That individuals, wherever they find themselves within society, hold themselves accountable first, accountable to their self, to their families, and to their communities, hold themselves accountable to their periphery. Accountability is ultimately about taking responsibility. And to soften the introduction of accountability, Arabs can start by strictly looking at their past, as it's much easier and safer than looking at the present. All involved should recognize this. The complications and consequences are negligible. By respectfully asking questions of their past that were never posed before, be it on a personal level or beyond. As I said, it's not about disrespecting anyone. Criticism will not impact God's plan for the deceased. It's about establishing a collective platform to move forward with, a platform that reconciles the historic good with the historic bad, to rectify misconceptions about who Arabs are and the perception of their present-day reality, to give and gain transparency on issues that will have zero impact on the current leadership or governments. The question is, on the level of nations, will this be sanctioned by the powers that be? For the various Arab nations, this would suggest openly recognizing and affirming that both leaderships and governments have at many a times failed their populations over the course of the last century. Because when that happens, when Arabs finally start to take responsibility for their actions in the past and then move on to the present, then by default, they'll take on board the responsibility for their future.